The wind didn't howl that day. It didn't even whisper. It held its breath. Samuel Cridge rode into Cold Creek with the silence, a man more dust than flesh, looking for a wagon part and nothing else. He preferred the quiet. The quiet didn't ask about the grave under the cottonwood tree or the wife he'd put in it. But today, the quiet in Cold Creek was wrong. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. He saw it behind the saloon, a knot of men, huddled like buzzards over a fresh kill. No laughter, no shouting. Just a low, ugly murmur that coiled in the gut. Samuel wasn't a curious man. He'd learned long ago that curiosity was just a faster way to find trouble. But he couldn't look away. He tied his horse, his movements slow, deliberate. Every instinct screamed at him to get his grain and ride on. Ignore it. Forget it. But the silence had a gravity he couldn't fight. He rounded the corner of the saloon, and then he saw her. She stood on a stack of old crates, a makeshift stage. Her dress was patched, her hair a tangled mess of blonde. One hand was draped over her swollen belly, a protective, hopeless gesture. The other hung limp at her side. She wasn't crying. That would have been easier to watch. Instead, her face was a mask of stone, her eyes fixed on a crack in the dirt floor, as if she could will herself to fall through it, to disappear from this waking nightmare. Two men stood with her. One was big, bearded, with mean little eyes that darted around the crowd. The other leaned against a barrel, chewing on a piece of straw, a smirk playing on his lips. They were her in-laws. He'd find out later. The kind of family that makes you wish you were an orphan. A fat merchant with dirt under his nails circled her, prodding her shoulder. "Don't look like much," the bearded one grunted. "But she's healthy, strong stock. Child's almost here. Be useful for a man with work to be done." A low chuckle rippled through the crowd. Someone spat. Samuel's jaw clenched so hard he felt a tooth grind. The girl didn't move, didn't even blink. "She ain't Charity," the bearded man snapped at the merchant. "Her husband passed, left debts. We're setting things right." It wasn't a sale. It was an execution of the soul. Samuel felt a cold fire ignite in his bones. He took a step forward, the sound of his boot on the gravel unnaturally loud in the hush. The brother-in-law with the smirk turned his head. "Looking to buy, stranger?" he sneered. And for the first time, the girl lifted her eyes. They weren't pleading. They weren't broken. They were hollowed out, scraped clean of everything but a raw, quiet defiance that struck Samuel harder than a fist. It was a look he knew. He'd seen it in the mirror every morning for 2 years. Something inside him, a thing he thought had died with his wife, snapped. He stepped into the circle. How much? The crowd went dead silent. The two brothers stared at him, their smirks vanishing. Even the merchant looked surprised. The girl, Eleanor, didn't look at him. She just kept her eyes locked on the horizon, as if his voice was just another sound in a world full of noise. The bearded man squinted. "You serious?" Samuel didn't say a word. He just stared back, his own eyes as hard and empty as the plains in winter. The man licked his lips. A greedy light flickered in his eyes. $50, he said. The price, a guess, a gamble. And that rifle on your back. A murmur went through the crowd. It was a fool's price. The rifle alone was worth more. Samuel didn't hesitate. He reached into his coat, pulled out a worn leather pouch, and tossed it into the dirt. It landed with a heavy final thud. Then he slowly, deliberately, unslung the old Winchester from his shoulder. He didn't hand it over. He held it out. The bearded man snatched it, his eyes gleaming. He counted the coins, his movements quick and furtive. "She's yours," he grunted, not even looking at his sister-in-law. He and his brother turned to leave. the transaction already forgotten. But Samuel didn't move. "What's her name?" The man paused, annoyed. "Does it matter?" Samuel's gaze flickered to the girl on the crates. For a split second, she looked back. "Yes," he said, his voice flat. "It matters." A tiny cracked sound came from the girl. "Eleanor. Eleanor Dumont." It was the first time she'd spoken. The name hung in the air, a fragile, beautiful thing in a place of utter ugliness. It was a name, not a price tag. A person, not property. In that moment, something shifted in the universe. The balance tipped. Samuel offered his hand. She stared at it for a long moment, as if she'd forgotten what a simple kindness looked like. She didn't take it, but she stepped down from the crates and walked toward him. And for now, that was enough. They walked through Coal Creek like ghosts. The townsfolk who had watched the auction now scattered, unable to meet their eyes. Guilt is a powerful thing. It makes cowards out of everyone. He helped her onto his wagon. She still hadn't shed a tear. She sat on the hard bench, hands folded over her belly, staring straight ahead as the wagon creaked out of town. The dust rose behind them, swallowing the memory of that cursed alley. They rode for miles in silence. The sun began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and purple. "You don't owe me nothing," Samuel finally said, his voice rough. "You understand that?" She didn't answer. She just gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. That night they made camp by a small river. He built a fire, the flames dancing against the growing darkness. He gave her his coat, and she wrapped it around her shoulders without a word. He offered her jerky and hardtack. She ate slowly, mechanically, as if food was just fuel, not comfort. "I ain't a man who saves people," he muttered, more to the fire than to her. "Just couldn't leave you there." The fire popped, spitting an ember into the grass. And then she spoke, her voice so quiet it was almost lost to the wind. "They weren't always cruel." He didn't reply. Some stories don't need a witness. "They said I was a burden," she continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Said my husband's death made me worthless, that I ate more than I was worth." Samuel stared into the flames, the heat doing nothing to warm the ice in his veins. They were wrong. She looked at him then, really looked at him for the first time. Her eyes were the color of a stormy sky. "I don't know where we're going," she whispered. "Neither do I," he admitted. It was the truest thing he'd said in years. Just then, the baby kicked, a sudden, sharp movement beneath the fabric of her dress. She flinched, a small gasp escaping her lips. He saw it. "You all right?" She nodded, her hand rubbing the spot. Then she asked the question that had been hanging between them since he'd tossed that pouch in the dirt. "Why? Why did you do it?" Samuel was quiet for a long time. He thought of Miriam, of her laughter, of the tiny, still form they had buried beside her. He looked at Eleanor, at the impossible strength holding her together. "Because I saw my wife's eyes in yours," he said, "and I couldn't walk away twice." A single tear, bright as a diamond in the firelight, traced a path down her dusty cheek. He rolled out his only blanket for her and took the cold, hard ground for himself. As he lay there, staring up at the endless sea of stars, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. Redemption, he realized, didn't arrive with a clap of thunder. It came quietly, in the dead of night, when one broken soul recognized another. Just before he drifted off, he heard a whisper from the darkness. "Thank you." He didn't answer. He just closed his eyes. Because this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. And he had a terrible feeling that tomorrow was going to demand a price far higher than $50 and a rifle. The morning broke thick with fog, a gray, silent blanket that muffled the world. Samuel woke before dawn, his body aching from the cold ground. He looked over at Eleanor. She was curled into a tight ball, her arms wrapped around her belly, as if shielding her child from a world that had already proven its cruelty. He built up the fire, his movements quiet, practiced. The smell of coffee soon cut through the damp air. When she finally stirred, he had a tin cup waiting for her. She took it with both hands, the warmth a small comfort against the chill. "My ranch is a day's ride from here," he said, breaking the silence. "It ain't much, but it's dry, and it's safe." She just nodded, sipping her coffee. He was starting to learn that her silence had many layers. This one was cautious, wary. They rode on as the sun burned away the fog. The land opened up, vast and empty. He found himself talking, filling the silence with pieces of his own broken history. He told her about growing up in Kansas, about his preacher father, about the wife he'd loved and lost. He didn't expect a response, and he didn't get one. But he saw her hands, clenched tightly in her lap, slowly begin to relax. He was giving her his story, a piece at a time, to show her she wasn't the only one carrying ghosts. When they finally reached the ranch, the sun was setting. The house was small, weathered, and leaning slightly to one side, but it stood firm against the wind. It was honest, like him. He helped her down from the wagon. "Let me show you inside." The house was sparse, a table, 2 chairs, an iron stove. A single room off to the side held a bed, covered with a beautiful, hand-stitched quilt, his wife's quilt. Eleanor stopped in the doorway of the bedroom. She reached out and touched the quilt, her fingers tracing the patterns as if reading a story written in thread. "I can sleep in the barn," he offered. Her voice was a whisper. "No, I'm not helpless." He just nodded and left a basin of warm water for her by the bed. Outside, he chopped wood until his muscles screamed and the sun had completely disappeared. It was easier than thinking. That night they ate supper in silence. Bread and beans. As they sat across the small table, the lantern light casting long shadows, he felt the need to say it again. "You're safe here, Eleanor." She finally met his gaze, her stormy eyes unreadable. "Safe don't mean not scared," she said. He knew that better than anyone. "I know." Then she began to speak. She told him about her husband, Daniel. "A good man," she said, "but tired, worn down by the land. He died of a fever, leaving her pregnant and alone with his family. They said I brought the sickness on him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They called me a curse." She held up her hands, thin and chapped. "Said I was just another mouth to feed." Samuel's heart ached for her. "You're not a burden," he said, his voice firm. She looked up at him, a flicker of something, anger, defiance, in her eyes. "You don't know me." "Don't need to," he said simply. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. Then she asked a question that made the air crackle. "You still going to make me your wife?" He was taken aback. He shook his head slowly. "Only if you ask me to." Her breath hitched. She looked away, out the dark window. "I won't ask," she said after a long moment. "Then I won't push." And in that moment, an understanding passed between them, an agreement. This wasn't about ownership. It was about sanctuary. The next few days fell into a quiet rhythm. Eleanor swept the floors. She cooked simple meals. She spent hours on the porch, staring out at the empty plains, as if trying to map out a future she couldn't yet see. Samuel gave her space. He fixed fences, tended to his mule, and watched her from a distance. He saw the way she brushed her hand against the mule's nose, a gesture of remembered softness. He saw her slowly, cautiously, begin to inhabit the space around her. One evening, as he was mending a fence, she brought him a cup of coffee. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, close enough for him to feel the warmth radiating from her. "I used to hum," she said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. "When I was a girl. I haven't in a long time." "Maybe you will again," he said softly. The next morning, as she was folding laundry on the porch, he heard it. The faintest sound, a note or two, broken but brave. A hum. He didn't look up from his whittling. He just smiled, a small secret smile. She was finding her music again. But the world wasn't done with them, not by a long shot. That night a hard rain began to fall, drumming against the roof like angry fingers. Thunder rumbled in the distance. He lit the lantern and sat by the stove, cleaning his rifle. Eleanor stood in the doorway of her room, a silhouette against the dim light. "Do you believe in second chances?" she asked. He looked up, surprised by the question. "I think they believe in us," he replied. She stepped into the light. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "You've been kind," she said. "But I'm still afraid." "So am I," he admitted. "I don't want to be owned," she said, her voice stronger now. "You're not. I don't want to be saved." "Then just stay." She walked over and sat across from him. The lantern light flickered, dancing on her face. "I don't know how to be loved." He looked at her, at the deep well of pain in her eyes, and said, "You don't have to. You just have to sit here and not run." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she reached across the table. She didn't take his hand. She just placed her palm flat on the wood beside his. A small gesture. A beginning. Just as the fragile peace settled between them, a sound cut through the storm. A loud, insistent knock on the door. Samuel froze, his hand instinctively going to the rifle on the table. Eleanor's eyes widened in terror. It was late. Too late for a friendly visit. The knock came again, harder this time, a sound that promised violence. He stood up, motioning for her to stay back. He walked to the door, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He took a deep breath, lifted the latch, and pulled the door open. 3 figures stood on the porch, rain dripping from the brims of their hats. Their faces were grim, their eyes hard. He recognized the one in the middle immediately. It was Eleanor's bearded brother-in-law, and he wasn't smiling anymore. "Evening, Cridge," the man said, his voice a low growl. "We've come to collect what's ours." Samuel's grip tightened on the rifle. "You're not welcome here." The man's eyes flickered past him, locking on Eleanor, who stood frozen in the lantern light. "We ain't here for you. We're here for her. She's carrying family blood." He took a step forward. "She told you no," Samuel said, his voice dangerously quiet. "That ought to be enough." The man chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "You think buying her with a used rifle changes anything? She's our kin. Her debt is our debt." "I'm not your debt," Eleanor's voice rang out, clear and steady. She stepped forward, standing beside Samuel, a silent, unshakable wall. "You gave up your rights when you sold me." Her brother-in-law spat into the mud. "You think he can protect you? This broken-down farmer in his shack? You think you'll raise that child without our name, without what's owed?" The tension on the porch was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The 2 men with him shifted, their hands hovering near their belts. But Samuel didn't raise his rifle. Not yet. He had a surprise of his own. "You're too late," he said, his voice calm. "You want to talk about rights? Go talk to Pastor Evans in town. He married us yesterday morning." The brother-in-law's face went slack with shock. "You're lying." "The town clerk was a witness," Samuel added, pressing his advantage. "It's all legal. She's my wife now, and this is my land, and you're trespassing." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something else he couldn't quite read. She hadn't known. He'd ridden into town alone, taken care of it without a word to her. He hadn't wanted to presume, to push her. He just wanted to protect her. The brother-in-law's face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He knew he'd been beaten. For now. "This ain't over, Cridge," he hissed, his voice full of venom. "You'll regret this." He turned and stormed off into the rain, his men following close behind. Samuel shut the door, the sound of the latch clicking into place, echoing in the sudden silence. Eleanor stared at him, her expression unreadable. "You married me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, suddenly feeling awkward. "Figured it was the only way to keep them off you. Legally." She was quiet for a long moment. He couldn't tell if she was angry or grateful. Then a small, wry smile touched her lips. "I was planning to ask you today." He blinked, surprised. "You were?" "I was," she said, her smile widening just a fraction. "Looks like you beat me to it." A warmth spread through Samuel's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It felt like hope. But as they stood there, the sound of the rain, a comforting rhythm on the roof, a new, cold thought crept into Samuel's mind. The brother-in-law hadn't just been angry. He'd been desperate. There was more to this than just a family debt. Something else was going on, something dark and dangerous. And he had just painted a target on both their backs. Spring arrived that year like a hesitant guest, melting the snow and coaxing green shoots from the frozen earth. With it came a fragile sense of peace. The days grew longer, warmer. Eleanor's belly swelled, a promise of new life in a place that had known too much death. She began to plant a small garden next to the house, tomatoes, lavender. Her hands, once thin and trembling, grew steady and strong as she worked the soil. She started humming again, her quiet melodies weaving themselves into the fabric of their days. They fell into a comfortable routine. He worked the land, she worked the home. They didn't talk much about the future. They didn't need to. They were building it, one day at a time. One afternoon she asked him to take her into town. He was hesitant. He knew her in-laws were still there, their hatred simmering just below the surface. But she insisted. "I want to see something besides these four walls," she said, a new confidence in her voice. She walked into the general store with her head held high. Mrs. Dinger, the storekeeper's wife, a woman with kind eyes and a sharp tongue, looked her up and down. "You look well, dear," she said, a warm smile on her face. "I feel well," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. They bought flour and beans and a small spool of blue ribbon. Eleanor didn't say what it was for, but later that day, Samuel saw her sitting on the porch, weaving it into her long blonde hair. She caught him watching, and for the first time, she didn't look away. She smiled. A real, genuine smile that lit up her whole face. That night, as they sat by the fire, he brought out a small wooden box. Inside were the few treasures he had left from his old life. A faded photograph of his late wife, Miriam, a bundle of her letters. Eleanor picked up the photograph, her touch gentle. "She was beautiful," she said softly. "She was," he agreed. "And kind." "The kindest," he said, his voice thick with memory. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "I'm not her, Samuel." "No," he said, his voice firm. "You're not. You're Eleanor, and you're here." Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of release. She was finally letting go of the ghost that had haunted her for so long. But their peace was a fragile thing, a house of cards built on borrowed time. It happened a week later. A rider from town, a young man out of breath and wild-eyed, galloped up to the ranch. "Mr. Cridge," he yelled, "you need to come quick. It's the sheriff. He's arrested Eleanor's brother-in-law." Samuel's blood ran cold. "Arrested him? For what?" "For murder," the boy gasped. "They found a body in the well behind the saloon. They're saying it's Eleanor's husband, Daniel." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Daniel hadn't died of a fever. He'd been murdered, and his own family had done it. Eleanor came out onto the porch, her face pale. She'd heard everything. "They killed him," she whispered, her voice a ghost of its former self. "They killed him, and then they tried to sell me." The horror of it was almost too much to bear. The debt, the threats, it had all been a lie, a cover for a monstrous crime. But something didn't add up. Why now? Why would the sheriff, a man known to be in the pocket of the town's bullies, suddenly arrest one of them? Samuel saddled his horse, his mind racing. "You stay here," he told Eleanor. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone." She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. He rode into Cold Creek with a sense of dread coiling in his stomach. The town was buzzing with the news. A crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office. He pushed his way through, his heart pounding. And that's when he saw it. It wasn't just the one brother-in-law in the cell. It was both of them. And sitting in the sheriff's chair, his feet up on the desk, a smug look on his face, was a man Samuel had never seen before. A U.S. Marshal. "Samuel Cridge," the marshal asked, his voice sharp. "I've been waiting for you. We need to talk about your wife." Samuel's blood turned to ice. This wasn't about justice for Daniel. This was about something else entirely. "My wife is at home," he said, his voice steady. "She has nothing to do with this." The marshal smiled, a cold, predatory smile. "That's where you're wrong, Mr. Cridge. Your wife has everything to do with this. You see, Eleanor Dumont is wanted for the murder of her husband." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He stumbled back, his mind reeling. Eleanor? A murderer? It was impossible. He knew her. He knew the quiet strength, the gentle heart that had been so cruelly broken. "That's a lie," he said, his voice a low growl. "Is it?" the marshal replied, his eyes glinting. "We have a witness, her own brother-in-law. He says she poisoned Daniel. Says he and his brother were just trying to get her to confess when you interfered. It was a trap, a twisted, diabolical trap. The brothers had been caught, and they were trying to drag Eleanor down with them." "He's lying to save his own skin," Samuel spat. "Maybe," the marshal said, shrugging. "But it's his word against hers, and she's got a powerful motive. According to him, the child she's carrying isn't Daniel's." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Samuel felt a white-hot rage build inside him. He knew with every fiber of his being that it was a lie. He'd seen the way Eleanor touched her belly, the fierce, protective love in her eyes. "Where is this witness now?" Samuel demanded. The marshal's smile widened. "He's being transported to the federal courthouse in the next county, left about an hour ago." And that's when Samuel understood. This wasn't about the truth. It was about closing a case. The marshal didn't care who was guilty, as long as someone hanged for the crime. And a grieving, pregnant widow was a much easier target than two well-known thugs. He had to get to Eleanor. He had to warn her. He turned and ran from the office, ignoring the marshal's shouts behind him. He threw himself onto his horse and galloped out of town, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. But as he crested the hill overlooking his ranch, a column of thick black smoke was rising into the sky. His house was on fire. He spurred his horse, his mind a whirlwind of terror. Eleanor, the baby, he had to get to them. He burst through the flames and smoke into the small house. It was empty. The cradle he'd built, the quilt she'd touched, everything was being consumed by the fire. A wave of despair washed over him. He was too late. Then he heard it. A faint cry from the direction of the barn. He ran, his lungs burning, his eyes streaming. He kicked open the barn door, and there she was, huddled in the corner, soot on her face, terror in her eyes. In her arms, wrapped in a blanket, was a tiny, newborn baby. "Samuel," she sobbed, relief washing over her face. He rushed to her, wrapping his arms around her and the child. They were safe. That's all that mattered. "The baby came," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Just before the fire started. A man came. He said he was a friend of yours. He helped me get out. He said he'd go for help." A cold dread settled in Samuel's stomach. What did he look like? "He was tall," she said, "wore a star on his chest." The marshal. He hadn't come to help. He'd come to finish the job. He'd set the fire to flush her out, to arrest her. Or worse, they had to run, now. He helped her to her feet. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. "They're coming for you." But as they stepped out of the barn, they were met with the sight of a dozen armed men on horseback, surrounding what was left of their home. And at their head was the marshal, a grim, triumphant look on his face. "Eleanor Cridge," he said, his voice booming across the smoldering ruins. "You're under arrest for the murder of your husband." They were trapped, outnumbered. There was no escape. Samuel stood in front of Eleanor and their newborn child, his body a shield against the circle of rifles pointed at them. The marshal dismounted, his boots crunching on the charred ground. "It's over, Cridge," the marshal said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Give her up." "Never," Samuel growled, his hand tightening on the worn handle of his pistol. Eleanor's hand was on his arm. "Don't, Samuel," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "It's not worth it." He looked at her, at the fierce love in her eyes as she cradled their son. She was right. He couldn't die here. Not now. He was all they had. "There's been a mistake," Samuel said, his voice ringing with a conviction he didn't feel. "She's innocent." The marshal laughed. "They all are. Now step aside." But before Samuel could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "I wouldn't be so sure about that, Marshal." Everyone turned. Riding up the path, calm as you please, was Mrs. Dinger from the general store. And she wasn't alone. Beside her rode Pastor Evans, and behind them, a dozen of the town's men, armed with rifles and shotguns. The marshal's face hardened. "This is official business, ma'am. I'd advise you to stay out of it." Mrs. Dinger rode right up to him, her gaze unwavering. "Murder is everyone's business, Marshal, and we've come to see that justice is done." "Justice is being done," he snapped. "We have a confession." "You have a lie," a new voice said. And from behind the riders, a man stepped forward. He was bruised, his clothes were torn, but he was alive. It was the other brother-in-law, the one who had sneered at Samuel in the alley. The marshal's eyes widened in shock. "What is the meaning of this? You were on your way to the federal courthouse." "We had a talk on the road," Mrs. Dinger said, a grim smile on her face. "Seems his conscience got the better of him." The man wouldn't meet Samuel's eyes. He looked at Eleanor, a flicker of something. Shame? Regret? On his face. "She didn't do it," he said, his voice low but clear. "My brother did. Daniel found out he was stealing from the homestead, selling off cattle and pocketing the money. They fought. He hit Daniel with a shovel." He took a shaky breath. "He said if I didn't back his story, he'd do the same to me. He was going to pin it on Eleanor from the start. Said no one would believe a grieving widow was a killer. The truth, ugly and brutal, finally came to light." The marshal was stunned into silence. His case, so neatly tied up, had just been blown to pieces. "And what about you, Marshal?" Samuel said, his voice cold as steel. "You were mighty quick to believe a known liar, mighty quick to set a fire and try to arrest a woman who had just given birth." The marshal's face flushed. "I was following a lead." "You were closing a case," Samuel finished for him. "You didn't care about the truth. You just wanted a conviction." The townspeople murmured, their expressions hardening. They had been cowards once, but no more. They had seen the truth in Samuel and Eleanor's stand. They had seen the injustice, and they would not allow it to continue. The marshal, realizing he had lost control of the situation, backed away, his face a mask of fury. "This isn't over," he snarled, before mounting his horse and riding off, his posse trailing behind him like a pack of beaten dogs. Silence fell over the smoldering ranch. The only sound was the crackle of the dying flames and the soft cry of a newborn baby. Eleanor stepped forward, her son held tightly to her chest. She looked at the faces of the people who had come to her aid, people who had once turned their backs on her, and she saw not pity, but respect. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with an emotion too deep for words. Mrs. Dinger just nodded. "We look after our own," she said simply. That night they stayed with the Dingers. The town came together, offering food, clothes, a place to sleep. The next day they started to rebuild. Men came with lumber and nails, women with food and blankets. They rebuilt the house, bigger and stronger than before. They rebuilt the barn. And as Samuel stood there, watching his neighbors, his friends, raise the frame of his new home, he felt a sense of belonging he hadn't felt since Miriam died. He looked at Eleanor, sitting on the porch of the Dingers' house, humming a soft lullaby to their son. He walked over to her and took her hand. "I think it's time we had a proper wedding," he said. She looked up at him, her stormy eyes clear and bright. "I think you're right." They were married a week later, under the open sky, surrounded by the people of Cold Creek. Eleanor wore a simple white dress, a blue ribbon woven into her hair. Samuel stood tall and proud, his son in his arms. They had faced the worst the world could throw at them. They had lost everything. But in the ashes, they had found something more valuable than any ranch or homestead. They had found a family. They had found a home. And as they stood there, hand in hand, looking out at the future they would build together, they knew they were not just survivors. They were pioneers of a new life, built on a foundation of courage, love, and the unshakable belief that even in the darkest of nights, the sun will always rise. Sometimes when the wind blows just right across the plains, you can still hear the faint sound of a woman humming, a melody of resilience and hope. It's a reminder that true strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up again and again and facing the dawn with a heart full of fight. If you enjoyed this story and you believe in the power of second chances, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You never know what other hidden stories are waiting to be told.